We join you up here, big guy. Well, welcome to Reasons to Believe. We're so glad that you're with us. Really excited about this class, and Dr. Kevin Stefanos is going to be sharing. And when he first approached me, I was super excited because Matthew tells us, in fact, when somebody asked Jesus what the greatest commandment was, he says, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. And today we get to challenge the mind and giving that totally to God. So I'm excited about what's taking place. And with no further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Kevin. Brother, God bless you, man.
Thank you. Check, you can hear me? Okay, good. So thank you guys for being here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kevin. And the question of God's existence has been one that I've been thinking about for the better part of 20 years. It's something I've been reading about, thinking about, watching debates about. I certainly don't consider myself an expert on this, but I have a passion to share this with others. So thank you for being here. But before we start, I just want to warn you, this presentation is going to go kind of quick. It's information dense. I'll be using a few technical terms, but I'm going to do my best to avoid unnecessary jargon and try to slow down at those parts that are difficult. And I think if we have time at the end, I'm happy to field questions as well. So since we have a lot of ground to cover, let's jump right in. So I want to start today by considering a couple of provocative quotes. The first quote I want to consider is from the famous novelist Ernest Hemingway. And he wrote, quote, "All thinking men are atheists." So is that true? If you are a person who thinks, is the conclusion that God does not exist a necessary conclusion you have to come to? Is a theist someone who does not think, who's maybe just emotional or unintellectual? The second quote I want to consider is from John McCarthy. And he says, quote, "An atheist doesn't have to be someone who thinks he has proof that there can't be a God. He only has to be someone who believes that the evidence on the God question is at a similar level to the evidence on the werewolf question." So is this true? Is the evidence for God's existence the same as the evidence for a werewolf's existence? That it's maybe some fairy tale based on someone's mistaken experience or something like that? So I think these gentlemen are quite mistaken. I think there are excellent reasons to believe God exists beyond a personal subjective experience, not to discount that. And we can't provide a proof of God's existence beyond a shadow of a doubt, but I'm going to present 3 arguments that I believe are extremely persuasive. Okay, so let's go to the outline of what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So the first part of what I'm going to talk about is the basics of reasoning and argumentation. So we're going to understand how to structure an argument and how to evaluate an argument. The next part is we're going to consider 3 arguments for God's existence. And finally, I'm going to briefly touch on some brief application. So that's a scope of what I'm going to talk about. I want to make clear what I'm not going to include, what's outside the scope of this presentation. I'm going to be talking about science, a little bit of philosophy. I'm not here to provide a robust defense of the integration of theology, science, and philosophy. I think it's a really important topic, but that's beyond the scope here. I'm also going to provide an introduction to these arguments. They can go very deep, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. Additionally, I'm going to limit my discussion to only 3 arguments for God's existence. There have been written probably several dozen of these arguments. I just picked 3 that I think are particularly good and maybe a little bit easier to understand. And finally, this is not a defense of Christianity specifically. This is a defense of theism, or the proposition that God exists. Okay, so let's jump in to the first part, which is reasoning and argumentation. So I'm going to first talk about deductive and inductive reasoning. And I'm going to present these arguments for God's existence in the form of a syllogism. And a syllogism is just a way to structure an argument. And what a syllogism is it's an argument that has at least 2 premises and a conclusion. So hopefully you can see on the screen there's a syllogism. So let's look at it. The first premise in this syllogism is Socrates is a man. The second premise is all men are mortal. The conclusion is Socrates is mortal. So this is a very basic syllogism to give an example. And when we evaluate an argument, we're going to evaluate it in 2 ways, deductively and inductively. In deductive reasoning, we don't worry about if the premises are true or not. All we're focused on is, does the conclusion follow logically and necessarily from the premises? So you can think about this as going down the syllogism. Does the conclusion at the end follow logically and necessarily from the premises? Well, if we go back to our syllogism here, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal. Does it follow logically and necessarily, therefore, that Socrates is mortal? It sure does. If we said Socrates is a dog, okay, that's not a valid deductive argument. So that's the first way that we're going to evaluate these arguments. The second way, and this is the way that requires most of the work here, is inductive reasoning. In inductive reasoning, we don't worry about the conclusions. We set that aside, and what we do is we consider each of the premises, and we consider, are they more true than their negation, than the opposite of them? And so what we do is we take what we understand about the world, about science, about our experiences, and we take all of that knowledge and we evaluate each of the premises to determine, is this a good, reliable premise? So if we go to the syllogism, Socrates is a man. Well, we take what we know about men generally. We take what we look about Socrates, and et cetera. Then you can weigh, is it more likely true that Socrates is a man or Socrates is not a man? Same thing with all men are mortal. So really, and that's a lot of where we're going to spend our time on these arguments. And so you can think of deductive reasoning as going down the syllogism, and inductive is going in. So you're using the information to assess each of the premises. So why are we talking about this? Again, the reason is I'm going to present these arguments for God's existence in a form of a syllogism, and we're going to very carefully and thoroughly evaluate it both deductively and inductively. And the idea is, if it is an airtight deductive argument and we have good reason inductively to believe that the premises are true, then we can take the conclusion as something we can rely upon. Okay, so with all that introduction, let's move to the first argument. This argument is called the cosmological argument. In a nutshell, this argument addresses, is the universe infinitely old? Has it always existed? Or did it start to exist at some point in the past? Did it have a beginning? And if it had a beginning, how do we explain that? What's the cause of that? So let's first start by considering the syllogism. The first premise is whatever begins to exist has a cause. The second premise is the universe began to exist. The conclusion is, therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, at this point, you might look at that conclusion and say, big deal. How does that get us to God? Wait till the end. I think that you'll see how powerful this conclusion actually is in the context of this argument. Okay, so let's do the first part of our analysis. Let's make sure this is a good argument. So deductively, is this a sound argument? Does the conclusion follow logically and necessarily from the premises? Well, the first premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Second premise, the universe is one of those things that begins to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Yes, this is a deductively airtight argument. So now let's get to the meat of the analysis, which is the inductive analysis. Are these premises more likely true than their negation? Do we have good reason to believe that these premises are indeed true? Well, let's take them in turn. Let's start with the first one. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now, this premise may strike you as kind of obviously true, and I think that's right, and we all kind of understand that this is true, but let's be robust about this and consider some reasons why we think this is true. The first point I would like to make in support of this premise is something cannot come from nothing. Nothing is not a thing. It is the absence of everything. It has no causal power to bring something into existence. It's not an object. Now, you might hear some skeptics respond saying, well, in physics, certain subatomic particles can come into being from nothing. This is something that I've heard quite a few times, and almost I would say in every one of these situations, it's an equivocation of the term nothing. They're using the term nothing in a very different way. They're usually talking about this quantum vacuum that's fluctuating with energy. Sometimes they even mean they have many positive particles that are weighed up by the negative particles, and the net sum is zero. Well, that's not what we're talking about when we mean nothing. So most objections to this point usually are abusing the word nothing. And think about this. If this is the alternative to a belief in God, then unbelievers can never accuse believers of irrationality. Because what is more evidently irrational than something coming from nothing? Or absolutely everything coming from absolutely nothing? Okay, so that's my first point in support of this premise. The second point is, if indeed something can come from nothing, then it becomes inexplicable why anything and everything doesn't just come into being from nothing. Why don't we have apples and houses and universes and planets just popping into existence from nothing all the time? Why is it that only universes come from nothing and only at one point in the past? What makes nothingness so discriminatory that it just creates a universe? Right? So that's another reason why I think that this premise is reliable. My last piece of support for this evidence is common experience and scientific evidence confirm the truth of this premise. It is constantly verified, and it is never falsified. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. We constantly verify it, and it's never falsified. So at this point in a debate, so I've heard this argument raised many times in debates between people who believe in God and those who don't. Almost invariably, the objection comes up at this point, okay, smarty pants, if everything has a cause, then what is God's cause? Now, please notice what the first premise is. It's not everything has a cause. It's everything that begins to exist has a cause. Now, this is not a special exemption for God. Okay, so by God, what we're talking about when we refer to God is something that does not have a cause, that it does not have a beginning. And if something caused God, then that would be God. And then whatever caused that would actually be God. And whatever caused that, you'd have this infinite regress of causes. Such a thing cannot exist. You cannot have this infinite regress of causes. Something has to be the original uncaused cause. Well, you only have two candidates for what this thing can be. Something within the universe or something outside of the universe. Well, something within the universe is not a very good candidate because as we're going to talk about in the next premise, the universe came into existence. Okay, so it's something outside of the universe. So really, this is a category error, this objection. Asking what causes God is like asking what is the cause of an uncaused entity. It misunderstands what we even mean by this. So I don't think this is a good objection to this premise. Okay, so I think we have very good reasons to believe that first premise is true. Now let's turn our attention to the second premise, which is the universe began to exist. Okay, first of all, what do we mean by the universe? What I mean by that is all space, all time, all matter, all energy came into existence at a finite point in the past. This is what we believe is in Genesis 1:1 is describing. This is what scientists are calling the Big Bang. Everything came into existence, including time. So I would like to present two lines of arguments to support this premise, philosophical and scientific. Let's start with the philosophical argument. In a nutshell, the philosophical argument is that an actual infinite number of past events cannot exist. I'm going to warn you, this is a little technical, it's a little esoteric. I'm not going to do this justice in the time that we have. But the idea is, if the universe has no beginning, then the universe has traversed an actual infinite number of past events, and we can never actually arrive where we are currently. And the idea is it trades on the difference between a potential infinite and an actual infinite. And what I mean by that is a potential infinite is I could potentially count from 1 to and you just keep going. But an actual infinite means you actually counted that number, right? Potentially, I could keep dividing this table in half and divide that in half and divide that in half, but actually doing it is something that doesn't happen. Actual infinites lead to contradictions. And so there's a difference between a potential infinite and an actual infinite. So the idea is an actually infinite number of past events cannot exist. Again, I'm not going to do the philosophical argument justice. There's much more that can be said about it, but suffice it to say we have good philosophical reasons to believe that the universe had a beginning at the finite past. Now let's turn our attention to the scientific arguments. The first scientific argument is the expansion of the universe. So throughout history, men have assumed that the universe as a whole was unchanging, has existed from eternity, and is generally unchanging. Now, the scientific community began to question this assumption in the early 20th century. Men like Einstein, Friedman, Lemaitre, Hubble. Not only were people like Einstein coming up with mathematical formulas of what we see in the universe that were demonstrating the expansion of the universe, but people like Edwin Hubble were actually observing in his telescope galaxies and everything moving apart in the universe. Why is this important? Because as time goes on, everything is moving apart in the universe. So if you play time backwards, everything is condensing to a singularity, an infinitesimally small, hyperdense point, and this is the beginning of everything. So the expansion of the universe was a very powerful paradigm shift in the early 20th century in the scientific community that Actually, the universe had a beginning. The second line of scientific arguments for the beginning of the universe is the thermodynamics of the universe. And I'm specifically referring to the second law of thermodynamics. What this says is in a closed system, the system becomes increasingly disordered. You increasingly use up all of the available heat energy, things become disorganized and chaotic, and you eventually have heat death of the system. Well, think about this. If the universe is infinitely old, then in infinite time in the past, we would have used up all of the available heat energy. We would have maximum disorder in the universe. But when we look out there, that's clearly not the case. We have usable heat. We don't have maximum disorder. We don't have maximum entropy existing. This is a very strong argument that the universe is not infinitely old. It had a beginning. The third piece of scientific evidence that the universe had a beginning is the background radiation. And what this is in that initial Big Bang event, when the universe came into existence, there's this afterglow that still exists. You can think about something that explodes. You can imagine it kind of still glowing. And this is what we observe in the universe. And this was such a big discovery that in 1978, scientists actually won a Nobel Prize for discovering this. You know, this may not sound quite persuasive to you, but to scientists, this was immensely persuasive that there's a beginning of the universe. I'd like to share just two quotes that demonstrate this. So this is from Robert Jastrow, an astronomer and a physicist who's an agnostic, by the way. He said, quote, "Some scientists are unhappy with the idea that the world began in this way. Until recently, many of my colleagues preferred the steady state theory, which holds that the universe had no beginning and is eternal. But the latest evidence, referring to this background radiation discovery, makes it almost certain that the Big Bang really did occur." Speaking about this background radiation discovery in 1978, George Smoot, an astrophysicist, said, quote, "If you were religious, it's like seeing God." So you see that these astronomers, these physicists, the people who understand this, understood the implications of seeing this. This was very powerful evidence that the universe had a beginning. Now, I know some Christians don't accept the Big Bang. They believe it somehow undermines the biblical account of creation. Ironically, it was the scientists that did not want to accept this theory because it suggested that the universe had a beginning. Now there's something to explain. Instead of having an infinitely old universe that doesn't really require an explanation, now you have a universe that came into existence and requires an explanation. Remember, at that time, most scientists believed in the steady state view of the universe, which had no beginning. And they well understood the implications of the beginning of the universe. I want to share just a couple quick quotes from scientists related to what I just talked about. The first one is from Alexander Vilenkin. He's one of 3 scientists who in 2003 published a proof for the beginning of the universe. It's called the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. Mr. Vilenkin says the following, quote, "With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." You hear what he's saying? This was a problem for the scientific community. There's now something that requires a very large explanation. Let's consider the next quote from Robert Jastrow, the astronomer and physicist. Quote, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries." So what he's getting at is that this Judeo-Christian worldview has been saying since its inception that the universe actually had a beginning. It took until the 20th century till the scientists actually lifted themselves over the last peak and then realized that. So all of that is to say Christians should not be afraid of the Big Bang Theory as though it's some unwelcome intrusion of science into faith. No, it is a well-established scientific theory that actually demonstrates the truth of the theistic worldview. Okay, so let's return to the syllogism. So going back to the beginning here, premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. I think I provided some pretty good reasons to believe that that's true. The second premise, the universe began to exist. Therefore, the conclusion, the universe has a cause. So we talked that this is a deductively airtight argument. And inductively, I think we have excellent reasons to believe that these premises are true. So remember what I said, if it's deductively sound and inductively a strong argument, we can take that conclusion as true, as reliable. So let's consider that conclusion. The universe has a cause. Well, that has some very big implications. And all we have to do is consider what came into existence and what does that suggest about the cause? Because something cannot cause itself. So let's go through this here. The first thing is time came into existence. What does that suggest about the cause? It's timeless, changeless, beginningless, and uncaused. Space came into existence. What does that say about the cause? The cause must be spaceless. Matter came into existence. What does this mean about the cause? The cause must be immaterial. Energy came into existence. What does this mean about the cause? The cause must be powerful. The universe is intricate and complex. You can say that the cause is intelligent. You may even say that the cause has aesthetic sense or something like this. And I would even add personal. The idea is, why did the universe suddenly come into existence? Why suddenly at this point? Again, I'm sort of speaking in temporal terms before time even existed, but how does something choose to suddenly come into exist? I would suggest that this is a personal agent making this decision. So I hope you can see that the conclusion is very powerful. The universe has a cause, and the cause is timeless, changeless, beginningless, uncaused, spaceless, immaterial, powerful, intelligent, and personal. So I hope that you see that this is a very powerful argument to support God's existence. Okay, great. Now let's move on to the second argument for God's existence. This is my favorite argument. This is called the teleological or the design argument. This argument addresses the scientific fact that various forces exist in the universe must fall within an extraordinary narrow range for the universe to be life-permitting. Let's consider the syllogism. Premise 1, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Premise 2, it is not due to physical necessity or chance. Conclusion, therefore, it is due to design. Okay, so let's be systematic about this. First part of our analysis, deductive analysis. Does the conclusion follow logically and necessarily from the premises? It does. If you have to convince yourself, take time, look at it. For the sake of time, I'm going to move on to the inductive analysis. But yes, this is a deductively sound argument. Okay, let's turn our attention then to the inductive analysis. Premise 1, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Okay, so first of all, what are we talking about? What is fine-tuning? What do we mean by that? The idea of fine-tuning is that the laws of nature can be expressed as mathematical equations. And within these equations, there are symbols that are used for unchanging quantities, things like the force of gravity, the electromagnetic force, the strong and weak nuclear forces. Additionally, there's arbitrary quantities that are put in as initial conditions on which the laws of nature operate, such as the initial entropy in the universe that we talked about earlier, the thermodynamic disorder. There are many of these constants and quantities, and they all must fall within an exceedingly narrow range for the universe to be life-permitting. When I mean life-permitting, I'm not saying humans. I'm talking like any kind of life whatsoever. So before giving some examples of fine-tuning, we need to get a sense of how large these numbers are that I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to give these numbers in terms of scientific notation, which is a 10 raised to a power. And the idea is whatever that power is, that's 1 followed by that many zeros. So for example, 10 to the 5 is 1 with 5 zeros. So let's just get a sense of what kind of numbers we're going to be talking about. So let's consider 10 to the 5th power. This is how many words are in the Bible. Okay, we're already at a very large number, just 10 to the 5, right? This is a big number. Let's keep going. 10 to the 10, number of internet web pages that exist. Okay, this is a lot. 10 to the 17, number of seconds in the entire history of the universe. Okay, we're into very large numbers, things that are just difficult to wrap our heads around. 10 to the 25th, number of drops of water in the Pacific Ocean. The last one I'm presenting here is 10 to the 80th, the number of subatomic particles in the universe. By subatomic particles, I'm talking protons, neutrons, and electrons, in a universe that is 93 billion light years across. Okay, this is a massive number. Okay, so now that we have a sense of how big these numbers are, let's talk about some fine-tuning. Okay, so let's give some examples. The ratio of electrons to protons in the universe is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 37th. If it's changed by 1 part in 10 to the 37th, the universe is not life-permitting. The ratio of electromagnetic force to gravity, fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 40th. The expansion rate of the universe, fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 55th. The cosmological constant, fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 120. And this last one is just my favorite because it's just absurdly large. I don't even know how to understand such a number. The low entropy state of the universe, fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123. This is mind-bogglingly big. And so the idea is, if this constant varied by 1 part in that very large number, the universe cannot exist. So how do we visualize this? One way that I like to visualize this is a giant dial. Imagine like a dial for a really big safe. Instead of having 99 numbers, let's say we have 10 to the 25th numbers, okay? The amount of numbers as drops in the Pacific Ocean. That's how many numbers are going around this big dial. And this dial can be set in any way. There's no reason it has to be set at any one number. But the dial has to be set to the one number, otherwise the universe doesn't exist, with 10 to the 25th options. I hope you see how big of a deal this is. You might be asking yourself, why is this true? Why does it have to be so finely tuned? Well, let's take gravity, for example. If gravity was just slightly weaker, you can imagine during the Big Bang, when the universe comes into existence, all of this mass would just spread apart. Nothing would coalesce to form stars, planets, heavy metals, anything like this. You would just have gas filling the known universe. This is not life permitting. On the other hand, if gravity was slightly stronger, when you have this initial creation of the universe, everything would collapse back on itself to make a very super hot, dense mass, also not able to support life. And I like to give one analogy just to kind of get a sense of how large these numbers are. So let's consider an aircraft carrier, a massive aircraft carrier. And let's assume that it's fine-tuned to the equivalent of the mass density of the universe that I previously referenced, which is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 59th. What this means is, if you added or subtracted 1/billionth of a trillionth of the mass of an electron, added or subtracted, the aircraft carrier sinks. 1/billionth of a trillionth of an electron of the entire aircraft carrier, it does not stay afloat. This is the kind of fine-tuning we're talking about for just the mass density of the universe, just one. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, this sounds awfully extravagant. Really, is this true? Is this something actually accepted in the scientific community? Is this, Christian pseudoscience or something like that? Actually, this is uncontroversial in the scientific community. This is well established. Let me give you a couple quotes to support that claim. The first quote is by Stephen Hawking. He said, quote, "In fact, a universe like ours with galaxies and stars is actually quite unlikely. If one considers the possible constants and laws that could have emerged, the odds against a universe that has produced life like ours are immense. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life." Let's consider a quote from an astrophysicist, Michael Turner. He says, quote, "The precision of the fine-tuning is as if one could throw a dart across the entire universe and hit a bullseye 1 millimeter in diameter on the other side." Remember, the universe is 93 billion light years across. It takes light 93 billion years to cross this. Throw a dart, you hit this little target. Let's consider one last quote from Paul Davies, who's an astrophysicist. He says, quote, "It seems as though someone has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming." So I hope that you see the fine-tuning of the universe is real. It is spectacular, and it's very well established. So let's return to that first premise. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Okay, so we established that fine-tuning exists. So those are the only options: physical necessity, chance, or design. Okay, if there's any other options, then we can consider them, but those are the only options. Let's turn our attention now to the second premise. The fine-tuning of the universe is not due to physical necessity or chance. Let's consider those in turn. Physical necessity. So these constants and quantities are not determined by the laws of nature. There's no evidence that these values are necessary in any way. On that giant dial, that dial can be turned any which way. There's no need for it to be on that number. So no, physical necessity is out. That is not a plausible explanation. So let's turn our attention to chance. Well, we previously discussed each of these constant and quantity must fall within an impossibly narrow range. And let me make this clear. If any one of these does not fall within the range, you do not have a life-permitting universe. Let's put it a different way. Every single one of these constants and quantities must be finely tuned. Every single one of them. You get one of them off, you don't have a life-permitting universe. This multiplies probability upon probability. So what is the objection? How does someone respond to this argument? There's really one primary objection. It's not that fine-tuning doesn't exist. The primary objection to this argument is what's known as the many worlds or the multiverse hypothesis. This hypothesis posits that our universe is but one member of a multiverse, of an infinite number of randomly generated and ordered universes. What that means is there's a bunch of different universes, there's an infinite number, and each of them have that dial set a little bit differently for each of these. And guess what? We happen to be in the one that had all of those dials set just right. And so what this argument trades on is this idea is, well, you're going to have all these infinite numbers. Eventually, one of them will have all the dials set right, and the people in that universe are going to think they're special. That's the nature of this argument. Okay, what are the problems with this theory? Well, first of all, there's no evidence for it. This is purely speculative. The evidence would exist outside of our universe, and we have no access to discover it. This theory is and always will be purely speculative. We can't say, well, let's wait till some more science comes along. That's not even possible in theory. There's a bigger problem. What is generating these infinite number of randomly ordered universes? This must be something extremely finely tuned to be creating these infinite number of randomly ordered universes. You haven't solved the problem of fine-tuning, you've just pushed it back one step. It hasn't solved the problem. There's a lot of other pretty technical scientific and philosophic objections to this multiverse hypothesis. They're really beyond the scope here. The point is to explain the fine-tuning of the universe without appealing to design requires a very elaborate, completely speculative model that can never be proven. So I want you to understand that's the alternative to accepting this argument. Okay, so let's return to the premise, or to the syllogism, I should say. Premise one. Premise one, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Premise two, it is not due to physical necessity or chance. Conclusion, therefore it's due to design. So as we discussed, this is a deductively airtight argument. And I think we have excellent reasons to believe inductively that those two premises are much more true than their negation. So I really enjoy this argument. I think it is a very powerful argument. And the reason is because it appeals to very well-established scientific facts. And the alternative to the conclusion of a designer is something so utterly probable, it's virtually impossible. Let me share a couple of quotes in relation to this argument. The first quote is from Frank Tipler, who's a professor of mathematical physics. He says, quote, "When I began my career as a cosmologist some 20 years ago, I was a convinced atheist. I never in my wildest dreams imagined that one day I would be writing a book purporting to show the central claims of Judeo-Christian theology are in fact true, that these claims are straightforward deductions of the laws of physics as we now understand them." Listen to this part. "I have been forced into these conclusions by the inexorable logic of my own special branch of physics." He was forced into this conclusion by the things we talked about in this argument. The second quote I want to consider is from Anthony Flew. This was one of the 20th century's leading atheists in the intellectual community. Before he died, he became a theist, in part because of this argument, because this is when we were making these scientific discoveries. Here's a quote from Anthony Flew, quote, "Although I was once sharply critical of the argument to design, I have since come to see that when correctly formatted, this argument constitutes a persuasive case for the existence of God." This is one of the intellectual atheists of the 20th century saying this. So I think this is a very powerful argument. Okay, so let's now turn our attention to the third argument for God's existence. And this is a different kind of argument. This is called the moral argument. In a nutshell, this argument addresses if anything can be right or wrong, good or bad, if God doesn't exist. So let's consider the syllogism. Premise one, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties exist. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. Okay, so again, let's do the deductive analysis. Does the conclusion follow logically and necessarily from the premises? Again, take the time if you need to. It does. This is deductively an airtight argument. So again, let's turn our attention to the inductive analysis. Do we believe that these premises are reliable? Let's consider the first premise. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Let's first understand the terms here. What do we mean by objective? So I'm differentiating objective from subjective. Subjective means dependent on people's opinions or dependent on people's minds. Examples of this would be matters of taste, such as food or enjoyment of a movie. These things only exist within the minds of people. There's nothing external to the mind here. People didn't exist, the opinions wouldn't exist. That's purely subjective. Objective means independent of people's opinions. Things are like the existence of gravity or an object existing. It doesn't matter if everybody in the entire world believes that it doesn't exist. It doesn't care, it still exists, right? Or gravity, if everyone says, gravity doesn't exist, it still exists. These things exist outside of people's minds. So I want to be very clear because this argument makes a very particular distinction between subjective and objective. So I want to have these clear. So let's consider an illustration. Let's first consider something that is subjective, like ice cream flavor. And we ask somebody, what's your favorite ice cream flavor? One person says chocolate, another says vanilla. Remember, this only exists within people's minds. If people disagree, there is nothing transcendent to adjudicate between the two different opinions. You can't say one is better. You can't say chocolate is better than vanilla. It just exists within people's minds, and there's nothing to adjudicate. Now let's consider something that's objective. Like, does gravity cause objects to attract or repel? Well, one person may say attract, another person may say repel. Well, okay, that's great and everything, but there's a thing called gravity that exists that's transcendent that will adjudicate between the opinions. And I hope that you see that even if everybody says repel, there is still something that is objectively true that they attract. So we need to keep these two categories very separate in our mind. What is subjective and what is objective? Okay, so now let's apply this to moral claims. Let's consider the moral question. Was the Holocaust good or bad? Okay, now let's consider if morality is just subjective. Okay, so one person may say it's good, the other person may say bad. Okay, remember, if it's subjective, it only exists in people's minds, and there's no way to adjudicate between these two opinions. They're equally valid. Okay, this is kind of an uncomfortable place for morality to be, right? It's subjective. We say, well, I don't think that's true, right? I think one person's right and the other person's wrong. Okay, well, let's consider if morality is objective. We ask the same question, was the Holocaust good or bad? One person says good, the other person says bad. Well, if you want to claim that this claim that the Holocaust is bad is objectively true, you have to explain something transcendent that adjudicates between the two positions. So either way, there's a rub here. There's something that needs to be explained. It's either subjective, and everyone is equally valid when it comes to morality. So let's say torturing puppies for fun. If it's subjective, then everyone's opinion is just as valid as the next person's. Even if you have 100 against 1, it doesn't really matter. It's not voted by democracy here. But if it's objective, which is kind of a more comfortable thought for pretty much everybody, well, then the rub is you have to explain something transcendent. Okay, so this really isn't a problem for the person who believes in God, right? Well, clearly the person who believes in God is clearly on the right side. I'm saying the right side of the screen, the objective side, because they have something transcendent to explain this. Okay, what about for the atheist? Okay, well, if they're the atheist and they say, okay, well, it's subjective. Well, okay, if you want to go there, then you cannot condemn people who do wrong because their opinion is just as valid as yours. You can't condemn mass murderers, for example. Now, this position is untenable. I mean, who really holds this view? Who actually believes that it's subjective, right? Okay, so the atheist says, okay, well, we're not going to be in that camp. Let's go to the objective camp. Okay, well, now you have a different problem. You now have to explain how there's a transcendent lawgiver who can adjudicate between these positions. So you can see that the theist comfortably is in the objective camp, but the atheist, which side are they going to fall into? So to have a consistent worldview, the atheist must either abandon the idea that moral values are objective, or they must abandon the idea that God exists. You cannot hold both of those views. You have to abandon at least one of those views. So I recommend whenever you hear somebody make a moral claim, try to understand which one they're making. Are they making a subjective claim or an objective claim? It makes all the difference. Most of the time, people generally are making objective claims. They think torturing puppies for fun is objectively wrong. It's not just a matter of taste. Let me give you an example of the difficulty for the atheist position. I'm going to give you a quote here from Bertrand Russell, who is another of the 20th century's leading atheists. He says, quote, "I cannot see how to refute the argument for the subjectivity of all ethical values, but I refuse to accept that the only thing wrong with wanton cruelty is that I don't like it." So what is he saying there? He says, based on my atheistic worldview that God does not exist, I cannot refute the argument that everything is subjective. He says, based on my worldview, I'm on the left side of the screen there. Everything is subjective. But he says, I refuse to accept that it's true. I refuse to accept that the only thing wrong with wanton cruelty is I don't like it. You see the dilemma that they're in. This is a very tough place to be. So an intellectually consistent atheist has to see that if there's no God, then objective morality cannot exist. So this is a very common problem faced by unbelievers. Whenever I've talked to people, I've heard people talk about this, an atheist often will jump from one side of the screen to the other, from objective to subjective, to objective to subjective. They'll say, yeah, God doesn't exist. Yeah, of course morality is subjective, it's just a matter of taste. And then they'll say, well, the Christians did something bad at the Inquisition. That was bad. Well, you ask the question, well, do you mean subjectively bad or objectively bad? Is that just your opinion, and if I disagree, they're equally valid? Well, no, that's not what I mean, right? Then now they want to jump to objective and say, well, how do you justify that? Well, it's subjective, and you can see this tension that occurs here. In order for an atheist to argue against God's existence using moral language, they have to borrow from the right side of the screen. They have to borrow objective morality to say that God and Christians and whatever do evil. They have to borrow from the theistic worldview to argue against it. As the apologist Frank Turek says, they have to sit on God's lap in order to slap him in the face. Okay, now I want to also make a distinction between moral values and moral duties, because I said moral values and duties in the premise. What is a moral value? A moral value refers to a worth of a person or an action, whether it is good or bad. So think about this. If God does not exist, we are just the byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning. So our behavior that appears to be moral is simply a form of herd morality that simply serves the purpose of survival and perpetuation of our species. So if this is true, then moral values are not objectively good or bad. They just aid in survival, right? They are solidly on the left side of this screen. If God does not exist, then we're just byproducts of evolution and social conditioning. That means morality is just on the left side of the screen. It's just subjective. Okay, now let's consider what moral duties are. That refers to our obligation to act in a certain way, whether an action is right or wrong. So remember, on the atheistic worldview, humans are just advanced animals. Animals do not have moral obligations toward each other. When a lion eats a zebra, this is not murder. When a great white shark forcibly copulates with a female shark, this is reproduction, not rape. There's no moral dimension to these acts. Now, if God does not exist, we are just a more advanced animal. So being advanced may mean we have preferences. We like this, we don't like this, we don't like killing, but it doesn't get you into anything objective. Put another way, if there's no moral lawgiver, how can there be a moral law? Let's consider an objection to this point that I'm raising here, and that is an objection called atheistic moral Platonism. What this objection posits is that moral values like justice, like mercy, and so on just exist without any foundation or even explanation. There's no need to invoke God to have objective morality. It just exists out there. Well, this view is bewildering on its face. How can these abstract ideas like justice and mercy just exist out there? And even if we accepted that to be true, it might provide a justification for moral values. But what is our justification for moral duties? If these things are floating out there, to whom do we owe obligation? How are we obliged to obey these abstract concepts of justice and mercy and these sorts of things? Let's consider another, definitely more common objection. The objection is we can have objective morality without invoking God. Whatever contributes to human flourishing is just objectively good. We're going to call that objectively good. Well, human flourishing is an awfully arbitrary and implausible stopping point. Remember, on atheism, humans are just one step in this evolutionary process. That is, it's ongoing. In millions of years, human will just be another intermediate step along the way. So why would human flourishing be any more important than, let's say, bacteria flourishing or mice flourishing? And even if this is true, we're still stuck in the subjective category. And the way I can prove this is you just have two people arguing about the point. And they just say, one person says we can have objective morality without invoking God, whatever, whatever leads to human flourishing is good. And another person says, no, whatever leads to human flourishing is bad. Is there anything to adjudicate? No, we are still in the subjective category. You cannot get to objective morality. Now, I want to be very careful about this claim and what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. People get confused about this all the time. What I'm not saying is all atheists are bad people. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying we must believe in God to do anything moral. I'm not saying we must believe in God to form a moral structure to society. The argument is not whether people can act morally. The question is, can objective morality even exist? Is it even a thing if God does not exist? Again, people misinterpret this argument all the time. I'll be very careful about what I'm saying. Okay, so I covered a lot of ground here. Let's return to the first premise. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. So I presented several lines of argumentation to support this claim. We can easily have subjective moral duties and values all day long, but we cannot get objective moral duties, moral values, and duties. Remember, if God does not exist, there is nothing transcendent. You cannot have objective morality. Let's turn our attention now to the second premise. Objective moral values and duties exist. So we can trust our moral experience. As I said earlier, we think about the proposition as torturing puppies for fun. Is that right or wrong? We have a moral intuition that, yeah, that's wrong. And we have no more reason to distrust our moral experience than we have to trust our five senses. Now, someone might say, well, people disagree. Well, people are mistaken. Not everyone agrees. Well, again, any argument that you can make to disprove our moral intuition, I can make a parallel argument that the external world doesn't exist because of disagreements with your five senses. For example, our sight, smell, touch, sound, they may differ between people. People may say the same car accident differently. Because there's disagreement, that means the car accident didn't occur, right? No, of course not. Just because people have disagreement doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So this is a parallel argument you can make. Any argument that you would make to distrust our moral intuitions would be this. I can make a parallel argument that you shouldn't trust any other sense that you have either. Some people, or additionally, people and cultures may seem different, but a lot of times there's a superficial difference and the underlying core is actually shared. For example, modesty might be in common between different cultures, but how that is actually manifested might be different. Cannibals might believe that they should love their neighbor. They just don't regard the other tribe as their neighbor, right? These are different applications of an underlying moral principle. Okay, so let's consider a sociobiological objection. Now, what is this objecting to? It's objecting to this idea that objective moral values and duties actually exist. What this objection posits is that our moral beliefs have just been ingrained into us over time by evolution and social conditioning, and thus they're illusory. It states that because we know morality because of evolution, they don't objectively exist. This is not a good argument. This argument commits what's called the genetic fallacy. You cannot disprove what somebody believes by attacking how they came to the belief. That is called the genetic fallacy. You must consider the merits of the claim. Let me give you an extreme example just to prove the point. Let's say that a baby is raised from infancy in a house where they're tortured and they're brainwashed to believe that the sky is blue and grass is green and there's snow in Antarctica. Well, because they had this nefarious way to come to the belief must obviously be true, must also obviously be false, right? No, of course not. How someone comes to a belief tells you nothing about the validity of the belief. You have to consider the claims and the evidence supporting the belief. Likewise, if we came to the belief, let's assume for the sake of argument that we came to understand these objective morality through evolution and social conditioning. That just tells us how we came to the belief. It does not tell us that objective morality does not exist. So even if you grant the underlying assumption, the argument doesn't do the work that people think it does. Now, there's a worse problem. This objection is actually self-defeating. Think about this. If atheism is true, then all of our beliefs, not just our moral beliefs, but all of our beliefs, are the result of evolution and social conditioning. Remember, though, evolution is not aimed at truth, it is aimed at survival. Now, much of the time, those overlap, but evolution rewards survival. As such, evolution will lead to skepticism about knowledge in general. And it would lead to skepticism of the idea of evolution itself. Remember, because you're only coming to these beliefs because they lead to your survival. So we have no knowledge, we have no ability to even understand it, even this objection itself. So this is not a very good objection. Okay, so let's return to the syllogism. Premise 1. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties exist. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. Remember, this is a deductively airtight argument, and I believe we have very good reasons to believe that the premises are inductively true. We can take the conclusion as true. Okay, so those are the three arguments I wanted to present for the existence of God. Now, I just want to briefly touch on some application. 3 points of application. First one is strengthening believers. The first one is these types of arguments should increase confidence. One should have a deeper sense of what you believe is actually true, that this is not merely wishful thinking. It should embolden people to live out their life in actually what they believe. It can also be an encouragement in a time of doubt and struggle. So good feelings might be lacking. One can meditate on these arguments and get encouragement. If you just think about the teleological argument, for example, that all of these things are being held in this finely tuned balance, that if that balance were to be interrupted at any time, life could not exist. And finally, fuel to worship God. So we can expand our view from God being some mere, distant bearded man in the sky. And I think it can also appreciate some scripture. For example, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, wow, when we think about that in terms of the cosmological argument and all of these scientific proofs and philosophical reasons, it enriches our understanding of this. How about Psalm 33, 6-9? Quote, by the word of the Lord the heavens were made, their starry host by the breath of his mouth. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the people of the world revere him. For he spoke and it came to be. He commanded and it stood firm. Again, consider this in terms of the cosmological and the teleological arguments that we discussed. Consider Psalm 19, 1-4. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth. Their words to the ends of the world. Think about it in terms, again, of the cosmological argument, the teleological argument. How much of a richer understanding of that do we have? How about in regards to the moral argument? Jeremiah 31:33. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. You can meditate on that in terms of the moral argument that we talked about. Okay, so the first point of application was strengthening believers. The second point is evangelism. Now, again, I'm not saying that these arguments are going to save somebody. A person needs to make a spiritual commitment. However, some people may hide behind objections to the faith, including some intellectual objections to God's existence. And we should be able to answer these basic questions. So let's just very quickly go through each one. So cosmological argument. The very existence of everything points to the existence of God. Remember, the Judeo-Christian worldview has taught that the universe came into existence. And it was science and secular forces that eventually came to this conclusion. Now, an unbeliever might ridicule a believer as being preposterous, but think about what the atheist must affirm. That absolutely everything came from absolutely nothing. That something comes from nothing. Now, what about the teleological argument? Remember, the numerous aspects of the universe are held in this delicate balance. This relies on well-established, accepted scientific discoveries. Now, the atheist must explain the fine-tuning of the universe, and every explanation other than God requires an absurd or something absurd, like the multiverse hypothesis, or something completely improbable. That's the alternative. The moral argument. Even if intellectual or scientific arguments don't resonate with somebody, maybe that's not their cup of tea, I mean, all of us have strong moral convictions. So to be consistent, remember, an atheist must abandon the idea that God does not exist or abandon the idea that there's objective morality. Think about this every time you hear a moral statement. Christians are doing something bad. You're doing something bad. I don't like this. Is that an objective statement? Well, you're not entitled to that if you don't hold that God exists. And so this argument puts a stone in the shoe of an unbeliever. Every time they have a strong moral conviction, you have this thought going through their mind. The final point of application is shaping the culture. And the point is that the gospel is never heard in isolation. It is heard in the context and the milieu of the culture in which one is born and raised. A person who's been raised in a culture that is sympathetic to the idea that God exists will be more open to hearing the gospel than in a secular culture. And if America continues to slide into secularism, then it'll look increasingly like Europe, where it makes it very difficult for the gospel to even get a hearing. Missionaries labor for years to try to overcome the cultural backdrop to win a handful of converts. And this is not scaremongering. This is happening in the world today. So it's crucial that Christians are involved in shaping the culture so that Christian belief cannot be dismissed as mere superstition. We need Christians to be seen as thoughtful people who are not just, non-thinking or religious buffoons or something like this. We need the gospel to be a real alternative for people to embrace. Remember, I'm not saying that people will become Christians because of these arguments and evidence. Rather, it creates a culture, it creates a milieu in which these ideas become acceptable to consider. So in closing, we first discuss what constitutes a good argument. If an argument is deductively sound and inductively a strong argument, we can take that conclusion. Next, we went through 3 arguments for God's existence, considering the creation of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, and the existence of objective morality. Finally, we discussed how these arguments can be applied to the Christian life by strengthening believers, evangelism, and shaping culture. So I hope that you see how those quotes I read at the beginning are very much mistaken. We have very good reasons to believe that God exists. And I hope I introduced some ideas. Again, we just scratched the surface. So if you want more information, you can talk to me, you can talk to Dane. I'm happy to open up to questions if we do have any. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. I do want to ask you, you can submit those questions and we can respond to those at another time. I don't think we have any that came up so far. Those of you that are here, Kevin, thank you so much. I listen to this in layman's terms. I think, how smart and how awesome, how great is our God? Just through it all, points to that, and it reminds me that the fear of the Lord, recognizing, standing in awe of Him, is the beginning of wisdom. And thank you so much for sharing that and pointing us in that direction. And we will conclude with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you. We thank you for all these things that direct our attention to you. And Lord, I pray now that you would, by your Holy Spirit, draw us to yourself. I thank you, Lord, that you're not a distant God, that you are personal, that you so loved the world, that you gave your one and only Son, that whoever believes on him would not perish but have eternal life. And I pray, God, that you'd open up our hearts, God, and that you would open up our minds, and that we would see you for who you really are, so that we can respond with everything that is in us in total surrender to your majesty. We commit this time to you, we commit this people to you, and ask you now to be glorified in everything we do. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you for being with us. We'll look forward to seeing you again. God's best to you.